Hello, today's video is going to look at the Vietnam War abroad and specifically our relationships to the war that's going on in Vietnam. And a separate video is going to cover how the Vietnam War impacts the home front. So, first of all, where is Vietnam? It's the orange colored country that you see here in Southeast Asia. And it originally was part of French Indochina, which also included Laos and Cambodia, that you can see on the map on the left. Today, Vietnam has thriving cities and beautiful landscapes that provide an opportunity for tourists to visit, even though they're continue to be a communist nation. They have rebuilt, and there are a lot of places that you can see on the left here that people like to visit today. And some of the places that I'm going to talk about in this video are shown on the map here of Dien Bien Phu, the Gulf of Tonkin, My Lai, and Saigon. Before the United States got involved, the French had controlled it, as I mentioned. And the French are going to control until 1954. So they're going to be engaged in a war themselves. Truman is going to look at the fact that the Office of Strategic Services is going to say the Viet Minh worked with us to help defeat the Japanese. And so we can work with Ho Chi Minh. But Truman and the US officials ultimately don't take that recommendation. And here's a picture of Ho Chi Minh. So the beginnings of our involvement in Vietnam start with Truman, even though there's really nothing much going on other than some very beginning discussions about how we might be able to help the French. It escalates under Eisenhower, where he does resist a military response. He looks at it and says, there's no battle here for the United States, but we do need to help the French. And in 1954, there was an attack on Dien Bien Phu that was an absolute disaster. And Eisenhower, remember his nickname is Ike, sought intervention with Congress. And Congress said, no, we're not going to help you. We're not going to give you anything unless Britain also agrees to, which Britain did not. So Eisenhower believed that the outcome in Indochina was ultimately more important than what happened in Korea. So he begins to provide financial aid to the French and to South Vietnam at this point. In 1954, the Geneva Peace Accords were signed between France and Vietnam in that summer, and it provided for a temporary partition of Vietnam at the 17th parallel and set elections for 2 years later to reunify the country. In the north, there was a communist regime supported by the Soviet Union and China. And its headquarters were in Hanoi, which is approximately where the D is in the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. It's up in that area. And the leader of North Vietnam was Ho Chi Minh. Well, the United States does not like communists, as we've already figured out in this unit in our Cold War discussions. And so they want to prevent elections that were promised under the Geneva Accords. And the reality is that neither side really wanted to have these elections for reunification. And so we're going to see this split happen, and we're going to have these two separate countries that are going to exist for a little bit of time. A new nation is going to be created in the South. Remember, we talked about SEATO the other day, which is Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. Eisenhower is going to help create this new nation in South Vietnam, the Republic of Vietnam. And there's a lot of military help, political and economic aid that's going to happen. And the person who is going to win and become the leader is Ngo Dinh Diem. And he is extremely anti-communist, which means that the United States likes him because he's against communism. Well, he claimed that his newly created government was under attack from the north. And in late 1957, with American military aid, he began a counterattack. He used the CIA to identify those he thought were seeking to bring his government down and arrested thousands. So he becomes repressive. There's a series of acts that are put in that allows him to hold suspected communists in jail without bringing formal charges. So just as we saw when we talked about Iran and Guatemala and Chile, where the anti-communist isn't necessarily the best person for the country, same thing's going to happen here in South Vietnam with Ngo Dinh Diem. But first, let's talk about the Viet Cong and how they come to exist and who they are. Well, they're known as the National Liberation Front, and they're communists who support a broad-based united front to help mobilize Southerners who are in opposition to Ngo Dinh Diem and the Southern Vietnam government. And in 1960 is when the NLF is born, and it brought together communists and non-communists alike in kind of an umbrella organization. They had similar goals. and anyone could join as long as they didn't like No Dinh Diem and they wanted to reunify Vietnam. Well, they became known as the Viet Cong. So when we refer to future slides, it goes between the NLF and the Viet Cong. The Viet Cong is a derogatory term that was given to refer to them, and it's basically a play on a Vietnamese word that means Vietnamese commies. And so that's what we'll see from here on out. So when you see those two different ones. The Viet Minh were people that were anti-imperialist communists that were founded by Ho Chi Minh, which you saw on the other side. And so Viet Cong are usually going to be communists who are fighting in South Vietnam, who we're supposed to be on the same side of them. And so it makes it extremely confusing because there's also the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, or ARVN, which are the ground forces that are allied with American forces. So one of the things you're going to see here, and one of the reasons we're going to lose this war, is we don't know who is on our side, because you've got South Vietnamese who are communists and you have South Vietnamese who are fighting with the Americans. And how do you tell them apart? You don't. Moving on to Kennedy. In 1961, he sent a team to Vietnam to find out what is going on in the South. Let's assess what kind of aid is going to need to continue. And this report comes back, and it's called the White Paper. And it argues for an increase in military, technical, and economic aid, and the introduction of large-scale American advisors to help stabilize the Diem regime and crush the NLF. Well, Kennedy's decision is, instead of a large-scale military buildup or negotiated settlement, the United States would increase its level of military involvement through more machinery and advisors, but no military troops of any kind. So he's escalating it, but there's still no Americans actually fighting. Now, things turn bad against Diem. There's a huge outcry because he's harsh and oppressive. Buddhist monks and nuns are going to be joined by students, business people, intellectuals, peasants, all in objection to Diem's rule. And the more these forces attack Diem's troops and the secret police, the more Diem complains that communists are trying to take South Vietnam by force. And this was a hostile act of aggression by North Vietnam against peace-loving and democratic Vietnam, is what Diem says. Well, the final straw is when Diem's brother, Ngo Dinh Nhu, had raided a Buddhist pagoda in southern Vietnam, claiming that they had harbored the communists that were creating the political instability. The result was massive protests on the streets of Saigon that led Buddhist monks to self-immolation, which is what you see in this picture. The pictures of monks engulfed in flames made world headlines and turned opinion against Ngo Dinh Diem. No matter how good it was that he wasn't a communist, he had to go. And so you saw these monks burning themselves in protest. So by late September, the Buddhists had turned into such a problem that the Kennedy administration began to support a coup attempt against him. And in 1963, his own generals approached the embassy and said, "We need to overthrow Diem. Here's our plans." And Washington basically gave their approval without really giving their approval. We didn't try to stop them. And Diem and his brother were captured and killed. And just to give you a timeline of when this is happening, this is 3 weeks before Kennedy is assassinated. So next we're going to have Johnson walking into this, where Diem has been taken out, and 3 weeks later, Johnson's president. So to begin the escalation of conflict, I'm going to leave it on this slide for a second, but I'm going to give you a little bit more background information on some of the things. Now, at the time, actually, I'll start here. There were about 16,000 military advisors in Vietnam, and the Kennedy administration had managed to run the war from Washington without really introducing combat troops. But there were continuing problems that were going on, and Johnson says, you know what, we need more aggressive action. And he's going to use a raid that is somewhat questionable by the North Vietnamese on 2 ships in the Gulf of Tonkin as a pretext for war and for expanding his powers. So now let me give you a little bit of information with this. So he takes over in 1963, and elections have already been begun in the process. And so it's the beginnings of an election year, pretty much. And so Barry Goldwater stands to benefit if Democrats are not united at all. And Goldwater is extremely hawkish, meaning that he's very much in favor of war. So it made the people really reluctant to question Johnson. And so Goldwater is very right wing. He says that the president is hiding a plan for greater involvement, and that he's also willing to use low-level nuclear weapons to keep troops from being involved. Now, remember the Daisy ad. That helps to understand some context for why Johnson would make this advertisement saying that nuclear war was at stake if Goldwater wins. Well, LBJ's instinct was to be protective. There are 2 alleged attacks. He is aware that they're faulty intelligence and there's no real evidence of the need to escalate, but he uses it as a pretext to get authorization. And it's a strategic show of force to the North Vietnamese and also sends a political message to the country. It passes almost unanimously, but you can look at it and say, well, it's kind of misleading because there's still a lot of skepticism over our involvement in Vietnam. And so here are the 2 incidents that I'm mentioning. In it should say 1964 on the second one, sorry there. But they're both going to happen in this Gulf of Tonkin. So that's going to lead to the issuing of the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution or the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, either way that you want to list it. And look at some of the wording here in it, that they have deliberately and repeatedly attacked United States naval vessels, a serious threat to international peace, deliberate and systematic campaign of aggression, and then take all necessary measures to repel an armed attack against forces in the United States and to prevent further aggression. And so this is important to understand that it basically gives Johnson broad military powers to do whatever he needs to do to win the war in Vietnam. And so keep in mind, as we talk about these different events, that the larger context is always the Cold War, that we are supporting the South Vietnamese through a proxy war against communists who are backed by the Soviet Union and China. And it's always about that. And even though we have no inherent national interest at all in this, we don't want to show weakness either. And so that's really going to help make this decision. Continuing on, actually, before we get to that, in 1965, Johnson's advisors say we can pull back, but LBJ goes the other direction because he's afraid we're not going to lose South Vietnam if not. And so he really wants to keep that. He's a reluctant warrior, you can kind of say. The entire presidency, he doesn't waver from the proposition that we had to prevail, that we could not allow Vietnam to be lost on his watch. His national security advisor, as well as Secretary of State, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, are all hawks who support war. And he's going to be warned by his vice president after winning the election in 1964 that it was time to get out. And everything he's been trying to do, his great society, everything will be lost. Well, in response, instead of listening to Hubert Humphrey, his vice president, he kicks him out of his inner circle and won't talk to him again until the end of his presidency. And so one thing that I don't have a slide on, but I want you to know is that when Johnson took over, there were only 16,000 military advisors in Vietnam. By 1965, there are 130,000 soldiers, troops, Americans in Vietnam. And by 1967, that number is 500,000. 500,000 Americans are now in Vietnam. And it's just getting worse and worse. And by the end of 1967, you begin to have protests against the draft, people calling for a halt in the war. The media is raising questions. And then you have the Tet Offensive. That happens in early January. And things begin to go from bad to worse. It's during the Lunar New Year. It's a time where they have agreed to have a ceasefire for a short time in order for people to bury their dead and handle different things. And the North Vietnam and the Viet Cong launch a coordinated surprise attacks against major southern cities. This is played all over the news because this is really the first living room war where people have the ability to see the news in almost real time of what's going on. And so when all of these images are coming back of people in caskets, even though we technically win the Tet Offensive, we didn't win the PR at all. And it's clear that the ongoing promises of success were not true. This was going to last a long time. And so people begin to feel that this is unwinnable and we should not get involved. So you also in 1968, in March of 1968, have an incident called the My Lai Massacre. And Charlie Company receives word that there's Viet Cong guerrillas in this neighboring village. And so they're sent there for a search and destroy mission, which is, I'll come back to in a minute what that is. But Army commanders had told them there's going to be Viet Cong there and you should search for weapons and everything. But when they arrive, There's only women, children, and some older men baking bread, like making breakfast. And they search around and they find just a few weapons. But then William Calley, who's the lieutenant, he orders his men to shoot. He says they're Viet Cong, shoot. And the village ends up being burned to the ground. 504 people died. Among those were 182 women and 173 children. And the US Army basically covers this up for a year before it is reported in the American press and sets off this massive anti-war sentiment at home and divides people over the Vietnam War. And this is why in only this war, soldiers come home not as heroes, but as baby killers, and they're spit upon when they get to the airports and they show up because of public relations nightmares like this My Lai massacre that happened. So the US strategies include search and destroy tactics, which is where they're going to go and check for weapons, they'll round up villagers, they'll burn down villages. The problem with this, again, is a PR nightmare, but in this case, it's for the Vietnamese who they want on their side. And one member of the army said, if they weren't Viet Cong before we got there, they sure as hell were by the time we left. Because of the fact that we were burning down their village and destroying their life, why would they want to support the Americans and the South Vietnamese? Two other things we do are napalm and Agent Orange. So I'll get back to that in just a second. In early 1965, the Viet Cong, or the NLF, attacked 2 U.S. Army installations in South Vietnam. And so Johnson's going to order sustained bombing missions called Operation Rolling Thunder. And this is going to be followed up with more bombings, because one of the problems is, where's the enemy? They're hiding. It's really hard to find them because Vietnam is a jungle nation. And so we are going to resort to napalm, which is incendiary, and it's going to be done to destroy the village, but it's also going to cause a lot of havoc on the country of Vietnam. And even worse than that will be Operation Ranch Hand. That is a defoliation program. Basically, they want to kill all of the leaves in the jungle to destroy it, to force people out. Well, it contains an item called dioxin, which, as it's killing the millions of acres of jungle, it gets into the food chain and the water supply, and it causes chromosome damage in humans. And there are hundreds of cases of children born with deformities. And these images of these children are actually pretty mild compared to some of the ones that I saw when I Googled Agent Orange. And so it's really sad that the long-term damage that was done by this leaf-killing agent that was used. And I have a video to show you a little bit more about Agent Orange.
What do you get when you mix 2,4,5-T acid and 2,4-D acid? You get a powerful herbicide that the United States military used during the Vietnam War, and one that's been tied to serious health problems for the people exposed to it. The answer is Agent Orange. Agent Orange was just one of a series of heavy-duty chemicals the US military used in Southeast Asia, called rainbow herbicides. There were also Agents Blue, Pink, Green, Purple, and White, but Orange was the big one. Some 20 million gallons were sprayed on Southeast Asian jungles, fields, and other targets over a 9-year period from 1962 to 1971. It was part of what the US military called Operation Ranch Hand, aiming to defoliate the South Vietnamese countryside. The goal was to rob the Viet Cong of food sources and places to hide. This kind of scorched earth fighting, clearing the land of anything the enemy could use, is an ancient military tactic. But using chemicals to do that was a pretty recent invention. England and the US developed tactical herbicides during World War II, but didn't really use them. Herbicidal warfare was first used by the British in the 1950s in what's now Malaysia. The US saw that and said, that could work for us in Vietnam. Thus, Operation Ranch Hand. But it would come with a price. In addition to those 2 chemicals I mentioned earlier, Agent Orange also contains something else, called TCDD, the most toxic of a class of chemicals called dioxins. Dioxins are dangerous, even in minute amounts. Veterans returning from Vietnam started reporting these health problems in increasing numbers: cancer, birth defects, miscarriages, and skin diseases, among other issues. Over 2.5 million US soldiers were exposed to Agent Orange during the war. And let's not forget about the Vietnamese. Researchers in Vietnam claim that some 2 million cancers and other diseases, and 500,000 birth defects, were caused in that country by exposure to Agent Orange. And despite some bilateral cleanup efforts, the chemicals continue to pollute the soil there to this day. The fighting in Vietnam may be long over, but its legacy haunts both sides of the conflict, thanks in part to Agent Orange.
Young people in large numbers came out and joined what became known as the Red Guards. These largely terroristic organizations were used to publicly humiliate, assault, and in some cases, even murder political enemies of Mao and the Communist Party.
Another strategy of the Viet Cong is guerrilla warfare, is that they're going to try to win the hearts and minds of the regular people so that the regular people will fight with them against the Americans. They also hope to fight a protracted war and get us bogged down in an unpopular war and a military conflict that we just can't possibly win. And that's really what they do. But even more is the fact that we just couldn't find where they were. And how can you fight a war against people you don't know where they are? Well, part of it was because they escaped into these vast underground tunnels. And the three pictures on the left are from the Cu Chi tunnels, which are very famous. And my mom had the opportunity to visit, and she took these pictures. And the guide is showing them how small the little hole is, and how the second picture shows how you just pull this little piece over to. You can imagine how American soldiers are going to run right past it and be like, "Where did they go? They were here a minute ago, but now we've lost them." And so that makes it really hard to fight when they're underneath you. And you can see from the image here that there were false tunnels, there were sleeping chambers, there was a hospital, a storeroom, even a place to cook. And so they could stay underground for days, and the Americans just simply could not find them. Well, Richard Nixon is going to run for president. Let me back up for just a second here and talk about the fact that LBJ is going to decide not to run for re-election in 1968. And this is going to set up a major crisis within the Democratic Party because of the fact that Hubert Humphrey, who's the vice president, is the one who is now kind of the heir apparent. But there's still this very strong anti-war presence, and he is just kind of associated by guilt of being the vice president with that. And so there's going to be, at the Democratic National Committee event, that week-long event, there's going to be riots outside, and there's going to be turmoil within. And so Nixon is going to try to run on experience. He's not going to be reactionary. And however, Nixon is paranoid. One thing to know about him. He is afraid that LBJ is going to announce a peace plan and thereby automatically give Hubert Humphrey the win in it. And what becomes known as the Chennault Affair. Nixon will attempt to undermine diplomatic efforts with North Vietnam in order to give himself an edge in the campaign. And what he's going to do is use the widow of a famous World War II veteran as an intermediary to South Vietnam. And he's going to send a message, please don't help LBJ. Find a way to stonewall it, and you'll do better under a Nixon presidency. And it wasn't until recently that we knew that Nixon actually ordered this campaign to monkey wrench the negotiations. And LBJ learns about this, but he decides not to make it public. And Nixon does win. And he has this secret plan also to end the war in Vietnam. He says, we're going to slowly withdraw the American troops and turn the fighting over to the South Vietnamese. This is known as Vietnamization. However, even as he's doing this, we see an expansion into neighboring Laos and Cambodia. And this is violating the international rights of two countries who are not involved in the war, and we're launching secret campaigns. Well, first of all, why are we doing that? If you see the red line on the left, you see what's called the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And this is the supply line that is bringing all of the troops and the food and the weapons and everything from North Vietnam down into different parts of South Vietnam. So they don't have to march straight through the whole entire country of South Vietnam to get troops to one place. And so the United States is trying to route out supply routes such as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. That's what it is. But also trying to get rid of communists who might be there and be aiding in the South Vietnam. And so this is the bombing of Cambodia is going to be a problem. And in fact, meanwhile, on the home front, there are massive protests that are happening. There are shootings on college campuses and all kinds of protests. And we're going to get to that in the other video. But just so you know that invasion of Cambodia and the bombing of Cambodia sets off a massive wave of protests. The students are extremely angry with the president for violating the sovereignty of those nations who were not at war with us. Back to Nixon. In December of 1972, the Nixon administration unleashed a series of deadly bombing raids against North Vietnam's largest cities, Hanoi and Haiphong. These attacks became known as Christmas bombings, and they brought international condemnation and forced Nixon to really reconsider what was going on, his tactics and negotiation strategy. And so in early 1973, the Nixon White House is convinced that had convinced Saigon they would not abandon South Vietnam if they signed the peace accords. So the final draft was initialed, ending the hostilities between the United States and North Vietnam. However, it did not end the conflict in Vietnam, as Saigon continued to battle communist forces. So our technical war with Vietnam ends in 1973, but our last troops will not be pulled out until 1975. So the war is going to ultimately end under Ford administration. So we're going to have multiple presidents that this goes through. So the fall of Saigon really marks the end of it. So from March 1973 through April 30th of 1975, the South Vietnamese army tried desperately to continue to keep their separate country, to save themselves from political military collapse. But ultimately, the North Vietnamese tanks rolled in. And in this picture, you can see the last Americans leaving the embassy to get onto a helicopter to escape as the tanks are rolling into Saigon. And that is the official end of the Vietnam War. It was the longest and most unpopular war until the war in Afghanistan. And we go by the basic troops on the ground there in Vietnam dates, which go from 1963 up until 1975, so 12-year war. Well, we're now approaching 20 years in Afghanistan, so it is now the second longest, but it is still the most unpopular war in American history. There were 58,000 Americans who lost their lives. The oldest was 62, youngest 16. The vast majority of them were killed were just younger than 21 years of age. There were 304,000 wounded, 75,000 severely disabled. There were some that were missing in action. And we spent over $200 billion on this war. And so the Vietnam, it has a negative legacy. It undermined public confidence in our government and institutions. And it undermined American confidence in using military force abroad and raised questions about our foreign policy, to be honest. The role of the media cannot be understated because it was different than previous wars. Instead of just looking at still photographs in a newspaper, you had actual live footage, TV footage of the war. There were reporters that sometimes would accompany people out into wherever they were going to fight. And you got it in such an earlier manner than normal. There was not this time delay of getting the information. And so it was unvarnished, meaning you got the raw truth of what was going on. And that just made it so unpopular. And to finish out, the big question is, this is the only war to date that America has ever lost. And so why did we lose it? Number one is we completely underestimated the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong and what they were able to do, their cunningness, how they were able to get other people to go along and help them. Number two is, despite dropping more tonnage of high explosives on Vietnam than the whole of World War II, Americans could not stop the movement of troops or supplies through the Ho Chi Minh Trail, as I just previously talked about. By 1970, the anti-war movement was a strong influence. Prior to that, the majority of people had seemed to support the war, but by 1970, that was over. There was a question of the efficiency of troops. So most of them were draftees. And the longer they were there, the more low their morale became. They began to get into drugs. There were concerns about desertion. And by near the ends of each term, they were just counting how many days they had left to stay alive. And so their heart really wasn't in fighting. And number five, which to me seems just one of the biggest, is we could not find the enemy. They hid in the jungles, they hid in tunnels. And again, how do you know who is ARVN and fighting with you and who is Viet Cong and fighting against you? In fact, there were examples of people who would befriend Americans and then they would come back later strapped with explosives to their chests and blow up our American soldiers. So we didn't know who was friend and who was foe. And that is really the problem with the Vietnam War. And that is all I have for the abroad portion of it, the actual war itself. And in another video, again, we'll come back and look at how some of these policy decisions affected what was going on in the United States and some of the events that I talked about, like the protests, as well as the Democratic National Convention and all that. We'll see how the two of them go together. Thank you.